Jackson, yeah, it works. First time. Hey, I missed you guys last week. I'm going to put it in football vernacular. I was on the inactive list. I'm glad to be back. So a couple of things. I don't have any pictures tonight, but you know, I've been to most of the barbecue places in and around Dallas. And for those of you that ate tonight, it was tough to beat that brisket. I did refrain from the mac and cheese. I got enough mac and cheese in me already. I just kind of have to stop sometimes. The other thing that I missed last week was saying a happy birthday to one of the members of our audience who's here week in and week out, and that's Dr. Ross Perot. I'm not going to say what number it is, but it was a significant one, and it was a round number. So happy birthday, a week late. So I'm about to give the microphone to Richard, but before I do, I was thinking about Dave Lieber, and I love, like probably a lot of you, reading his columns in the morning news, and I was reading the one from the other day, and he was talking about how he could never get anybody to call him back. He said, you know, people, he's trying to do a story, and he said there was even one case of two people that were involved, two entities in a lawsuit against each other, and neither one of them would talk to him about it, even the winner. But what I thought was, look, Dave, remember, hi, I'm Mike Wallace. I'm from 60 Minutes. There you are. Hi, I'm Dave Lieber. I'm from the Dallas Morning News. But he's really fun to read. The articles are always enlightening, and you know, you always learn a lot. And so I think we're going to learn a lot tonight. So I'm going to get out of here and give this to Richard Stanford to welcome us, and then Susan Wilson to introduce Dave Lieber.
Thanks, Dave. Now, I'm on the Rejebian committee, and the only reason I'm here tonight is because Stephanie Newland, our very talented head of Belong Disability Ministries, texted me this morning and said, I've got COVID. How many people do you know who have COVID right now? I mean, it's just amazing. But anyway, I still want to say a word about the ministry she heads up, because Belong Disability, all the different things they do, a little different. Trissy Osborne spoke to you last few weeks ago about Journey, which is for dementia respite on Thursdays. This is different. These are people of all ages with various disabilities. And our programs, we run Night Owls, which is respite some Friday nights where you can have some time out, and we take care of your loved one. Chances Cafe, where people with disabilities can work, and they actually work around this church and over in Tolleson with Chances. The classes we have for people with disabilities of all ages on Sunday mornings over in Tolleson, of all ages from the little ones all the way to middle-aged and older men and women. And the thing we're really proud of right now is Spotlight, our movie, Into the Spotlight. We actually were in contention for documentary Oscars this next year. Don't think we made the final cut, but we've won all kinds of movie festival first places, including the Dallas Film Festival's first place. It's about what goes on here every year in February. For 5 months or more, these people put together a show. And this one, Into the Spotlight, we recorded. You'll be able to see it pretty soon, probably on streaming services. But it's the story of how one of those shows comes together and ends up. Try that sometime. And if you have somebody with disabilities in your family, being theater, being on the stage is so much fun for them and so much fun for us. So all those things are in our Beyond Disability Ministries, and I didn't want Stephanie's COVID to keep us from sharing that message. So let's pray, and I'll introduce Susan. Father, help us be people of gratitude. We talk about divisions in this country. We talk about a lot of things. We see glass half empty, but the fact is our glass is pretty much full. And we thank you, Father, for the culture we live in, for our faith communities, for our health systems, for the cultures, the opportunities we have like tonight. We live in a very rich time. This is the good old days today. and help us remember that and be people of gratitude. We pray all of that in your name. Amen. And now Susan will introduce Dave Lieber.
Good evening. Our guest speaker today is celebrating his 49th year as a daily newspaperman. He is the Watchdog investigative reporter for the Dallas Morning News. He's also a playwright with 2 plays performed. One was about Ross Perot, and the other is Amon, the ultimate Texan. For that one, there's been 59 shows around Texas so far. 3 were performed this month at Grapevine's Palace Theater. Busy year for Dave Lieber. In a statewide contest, he was named Texas's best columnist, and he also received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Society of Professional Journalists. He's the author of 10 books, and his newest on Dandy Don Meredith may be his best. Are you ready for some football? Oh, yeah. Mr. Dave Lieber.
Good job. Good job. I am so honored to be with you tonight in this historic church, the 68th rendition of this event. And I like to travel when I go to Rejebian groups with Mrs. Rejebian. I bring her with me because she's my good luck charm. You know, I'll be at the Grand Prairie Rejebian Club, and I'll bring it. And I just have something I'd like to say about her. I wish Mrs. Rejebian could be here to see the legacy she held so dear. A creator of this grand event, her influence felt by both ladies and gent. For the 3rd or 4th time I take this stage, first time was in a bygone age. Thanks to her, Dallas thrives, with book clubs improving many lives. Enlighten, educate, entertainment they seek, a mission strong, a purpose unique. As a writer, nothing more I prize, that's what these clubs symbolize. So thank you, Mrs. Rejebian, once more. Your spirit lingers, a gentle lore. Sit beside me, my good luck charm, for in your presence I feel no harm. You'll see me drinking some Snapple tonight, and the reason is because about 6 months ago, when I was halfway through the research on the book, I started drinking a lot of Snapple. And then I read that Don Meredith's favorite drink was Snapple. So I think Don's been sending me these Snapples. Well, no, maybe not, because if he was, he'd be sending me bourbon, I think, right? Yeah. So let's start off in the year 1938. A little boy is born in Mount Vernon, Texas. Who here is from Mount Vernon? I know some of you are. And his name was Joseph Donald Meredith, but they called him Joe Don. And there's something I'm going to tell you about him right now, about his infancy, that you probably don't know. Nobody really knows it. It's something I discovered during my research. But when Don Meredith was a little baby boy in the crib, an infant, he had polio. And he stayed in his crib for 7 or 8 months. And then somehow it healed. And but he was always self-conscious about his skinny legs. He looked great from the torso up, but from the down, his legs were like toothpicks. And Coach Landry said, the only thing wrong with Don is his legs. He used to stick like padding in his socks to make his legs look bigger. And why did he get injured so much as an NFL player? Because he was a polio victim, and he did the best he could. He said, God gave me this body, and I'm doing the best I can with it. Who here knew that Don Meredith had polio as a child? Stick with me. There's plenty more. High up there, balcony, I don't mean to forget you. So let me be clear that this book that I wrote, Dandy Don Meredith, the First Dallas Cowboy, came out July 3rd. It's not a football book. I'm not a football writer. It turned out to be a love story, a story about people who loved him and how he loved his teammates and how he loved his folks in Mount Vernon and how mostly, though, how millions of Americans loved him. And I wanted to find out why it was that this man was so popular. This is the trilogy that I've basically finished. The first was about Amon Carter, Mr. Fort Worth. The second was about Ross Perot, Mr. Dallas. And now I have Don. And people say, why do you pick these guys? And I say, because their stories are so good that we can't afford to lose them. We've got to keep them because they're wonderful stories. And we'll share so many tonight. In Don's case, though, I don't think he loved anything more than besides his wife, Susan, of 40 years, he loved Mount Vernon. He just loved his classmates, everything about the town. And, millions of Americans came to know him because of someone else, a man named Howard Cosell, right, who liked to tell it like it is, right? And that's really, you go back to the origin story of Don. Long before Howard Cosell and all that stuff happened, we've got little Joe Don in his backyard in Mount Vernon, and his mama, who won an athletic scholarship of her own, she set up a swinging tire in the backyard, and she had a quilt behind it to catch it, and she'd swing the tire, and he'd step back, and he'd throw. And he was really good. This was like the thing that his mom did with him. My mom didn't do that with me, but that's right. So after a while, the people in Mount Vernon are noticing that this little kid is a really great thrower. And so they asked the bus driver at Mount Vernon Elementary School, a name that should not be lost to history, a man named Norval Lawrence. They said, Norval, will you take Don out at the end of each 8th period of every day in school and take him to the parking lot and practice throwing with him? And so Norval did that. And Don, after a few months working with Norval, got to throw really accurate and really long. I just love that. Norval Lawrence. And I confirmed it with somebody outside in the lobby. Yep, Norval Lawrence was the bus driver. My book is the only book that's come out on Don Meredith. Here it is. My book is not the only book that came out on Don Meredith, because this children's book was written a few years ago. And it's really sweet, but it's for kids. And so one day, a woman at the Greenville Book Club, she says to me, why don't you write a story about Don Meredith, a book about him? And I go, well, there must be 10 books about him. And she said, I don't think there are. And I went and looked, and this was the only one. And so I thought, okay, how could that be that no one would ever write a biography of him? That's just amazing to me, because the stories are so great. I'll just tell you a couple of stories from his school years that I love that show what kind of character he had. There was a kid in school one day who brought a cherry bomb. Remember cherry bombs? You had to throw them on the ground and they'd pop. Well, the kid who brought it couldn't make it pop, but Don had a great arm, right? So Don throws it on the ground and it pops, explodes, and the whole school goes into a tizzy. And they launch this investigation, and they start calling in all the kids. Did you do it? Who did it? Did you do it? Who did it? It turned out that at this Mount Vernon school, they had the code of silence. They didn't even know what omerta was, but nobody ratted out Don because they loved Don. Well, the basketball coach said, if I find out that guy who did it is on my team, I'm going to kick him off the team. Okay? So then they get to Don, and they said, Don, do you know who did it? And he said, yes. Who? Me. The coach changed his mind. Isn't that Texas up there in the balcony? That's Texas, right? So, but the point of the story is that his classmates loved him so much they weren't going to rat him out. Another story from school that I really love about him that I discovered in the town history book, which is a beautiful book, was there was a girl that would come to school every day. It was before they had a cafeteria, so they had to bring their own food. And she would bring every day an onion and a biscuit. That was her lunch, because the family was in poverty. So the kids all made fun of her. And Don didn't like that. So Don would sit and eat lunch with her, and I really think that was a sweet moment for him. He was a I can't say it, the salutarian of his class. And salutatorium, thank you. Thank you. Were you one of those? Yeah, salutatorium. And at the library at SMU, his wife, Susan, donated all his papers, and his speech is in there. And it's really a great talk about how we are now responsible for what we do with the rest of our lives. He went to SMU, and the joke is he picked SMU because A, he could spell it, and B, it was close, right? And he did something at SMU that quarterbacks in college don't do. He graduated in 4 years with a business degree, And he was such a big man on campus that the president of the university, a guy named Tate, announced at a fundraising drive that they were going to change the name of Southern Methodist University to Southern Meredith University. He was so popular, that's where I think he got the nickname Dandy Don from. But he was so popular at SMU because they put him in as a sophomore, a quarterback against UT, at UT. And the coach of UT was a gentleman named Darrell Royal. This was 40 years before they renamed the stadium Darrell Royal Stadium. And Don, in his first start, threw touchdowns, ran for touchdowns, punted, kicked field goals, just wiped the floor with UT. Sorry about the UT people. And then the next week, he did the same thing in Arkansas. And the next week, he did the same thing to Baylor, knocked Baylor out of the top 10. And he had a 61% passing record, which was unheard of. It was an NCAA record. And he made All-American twice. But then something really happened after he graduated from college, something really amazing. A man you all know named Clint Murkison, Jr., the founder of the Cowboys, he liked Don, and he said, Don, I'm starting a new football team, an NFL team in Dallas. And I would like you to join the team. It was called the Dallas Rangers. That's the name. And Murkison said, I'm going to give you It was $150,000 for 5 years. And if you can't play quarterback, then that's okay. You'll work in my law firm. So $150,000 in today's money is $1.6 million. $1.6 million for a young man, 21, who never stepped a foot on a pro football field. You probably remember this. A lot of you are too young, but there was another team starting up at the same time. It was called the Dallas Texans, and Lamar Hunt owned it. And, of course, they became the Kansas City Chiefs. And my wife, who's sitting there in the back, says, well, that's like as close as we're going to get to winning the Super Bowl. Kansas City, that's like us, so we'll take it, You know that expression, he took me for a song, meaning I got something real cheap. The way the Cowboys, and once Clint got the team, they stopped being the Dallas Rangers, they became the Dallas Cowboys. Clint couldn't get the vote of George Marshall, the Washington Redskins owner. Marshall was the only head coach in the NFL who wouldn't put a black player on his team. But his wife wrote a theme called Hail to the Redskins. And then she divorced Marshall, but she kept the rights to the song. And she went to Clinton. She said, would you like to buy my husband's fight song? And he said, you're darn right I would. And so he paid him, and then Clint goes and knocks on the door at the owners' meeting for Marshall, and says, hey, Marshall, how'd you like to play your song, Never Again? What are you talking about? He says, I own the rights to your song. There was a string of epithets, and then Marshall said, okay, I give up, I'll vote for you, and that's how the Cowboys came about, quote, for a song. I just don't want these stories to die. They're so wonderful. In 1960, the year that the Cowboys played their first game, it was the only game in town. There were no other pro teams. There was the Lamar Hunt team, but there was no Dallas Stars in hockey. There was no Mavericks basketball. There was no Texas Rangers. And so what we had was the first celebrity superstar in Dallas, Don Meredith. Here we are today. I would suggest that no metropolitan area in the country is more aligned, connected with a team than Dallas and the Dallas Cowboys. I mean, it is the #1 franchise in America, in the world, worth $9 billion today. And, they're in Oxnard right now for their training camp. And every single day there's a story on the news about the Cowboys. Even if nothing happened, there's still a story, And it's always the same story. Some guy named JJ says, we're going to do it this year, but we'll get to that. I was amazed to see how different the NFL was back in the early 60s. A ticket to a Cowboys game cost $5. $5. And there were no personal seat licenses. And when a player scored a touchdown, he didn't do a tribal dance, pretend he was rowing a boat, jump around, spike it, and jump in the Salvation Army barrel. He got up, he handed the referee the football like a gentleman, We watched those games in black and white mostly. And, the players back then, they didn't make hardly anything. A big salary for an NFL player back then was $20,000 a year. And Tom Landry had an insurance business in Dallas. And Clint hired Don first, the first Dallas Cowboy, and then he hired Landry. And Landry said, I got to get to Dallas, Tex, because I got to run my insurance business. And Tex said, you ain't running no insurance business. You're going to be a full-time coach for the Dallas Cowboys. How many of you knew that Coach Landry had an insurance business? You did? Yeah, okay, good for you. And stick around, there's more, right? So when Don Meredith, the first Dallas Cowboy, walked into the Cotton Bowl as the backup QB for Eddie Lieber, there was no way that anybody could have had any idea what was about to start at that time, because there had never been a Dallas Cowboy quarterback. And now the Dallas Cowboy quarterback is the most important figure in all of American sports. I mean, when Dak burps, they put it on the news. And it runs all over the country. The Cowboys stuff runs all over the country, not here. But what our boy Don did was he laid the groundwork for the most prestigious position in all of sports. You can name these guys by their last name, like Staubach, Aikman, Romo, Prescott. It all began with Don, the first Dallas sports celebrity. Brief resume, grew up 100 miles from here, about in the northeasterly direction in Mount Vernon. And as he would always say on TV, he never forgot who he was. He'd say, I've always known who I was. I'm Billy Jack's little brother and Jeff and Hazel's baby boy, and I'm from Mount Vernon, Texas. That boy had charisma right out of the gate. In fact, his father, Jeff, owned a dry goods store, and he put little 6-year-old Don on the counter by the front door, and he said, Don, I want you to say hello to everybody when they walk in my store, and I want you to say their name. And Don said, why do I have to say their name? And he said, because even a dog likes to hear his name. So Don met everybody in town, and they were like, hello, Mrs. Smith, hello, Mr. Thomas, and he just developed, great friendships with people. My favorite story is about this young girl named Lynn Reynolds. She was 5 years old. And at first I didn't believe this. But Don was such a big man in town as a teenager that when her father said, hey, honey, look, here comes Don Meredith down the street. And she said, quote, oh my goodness, and my hair is a mess. I'll get a drink of some Don bourbon here. So the girls all had crushes on Don. The boys looked up to him and they respected him as both an athlete, a friend, and a scholar. And, excuse me, this book just came out July 3rd, and I'm still learning how to talk about it. So, 9 dramatic seasons followed of Don Meredith football, 1960 to 1968, including 2, and you remember this sadly, where they almost made it to the Super Bowl. One time they lost by 1 yard, and one time they lost by 6 yards. And it was tough because they say that Don Meredith was the only superstar quarterback who never got to play in a Super Bowl. But he did get to play in the Ice Bowl. I'm going to jump ahead on that. Some of you probably don't know the Ice Bowl because you weren't paying attention back then, but that was the game where they played in minus 46-degree wind chill factor against Green Bay. It was minus 19 or something like that on the field, and Don would come back to the huddle. His mouth would be frozen, and he'd try and call a play, and he'd go, But in the book, I just want to jump ahead real quick on this and tell you that I looked at some video of Coach Vince Lombardi, talking about the game against the Cowboys, and then I brought in a body language expert, and I said, look at the way Vince is acting in this, talking about the Cowboys. Is he cheating? Is he lying? And the body expert said, yeah, you can see he's totally lying. I try and make the point in this book that that Vince Lombardi cheated in the Ice Bowl. And if that really had happened, it's called the Tom Landry, it's called the Vince Lombardi Super Bowl trophy, right? Maybe it could have been called the Coach Tom Landry Super Bowl if it hadn't been for the Ice Bowl. But of course, everybody knows that what happened next. Well, okay, there was a moment where what happened next, Monday Night Football, didn't happen. Right after Don quit at age 32, when quarterbacks are at their prime, he became a stockbroker. And he wasn't very good. He made $120,000 a year as the Cowboys' #1 salary pick, but he was now making $12,000 a year as a stockbroker. And I think what drew him off was he went to this office of, as he told it, Mr. Big. And Mr. Big had a big desk and a big window and a big cigar, and Don was trying to sell him some stock. And the guy said, I'll tell you what, Don, I really have always liked you. Every once in a while, I'm going to throw you a bone. Don walked out of there all ticked off. He says, no one throws Don Meredith a bone. I'm the one that throws the bones. And so Don decided the stockbroker thing wasn't working out. So Frank Gifford says to Roone Arledge, we need to get a third guy in the booth for this Monday Night Football, and I know who to pick. It's a guy named Don Meredith. So Roone Arledge, the star of ABC News and Sports, calls Don and says, I want to talk to you about doing Monday Night Football. And then Don calls him back like 10 times, and Roone won't call him back. So finally they meet at a fancy New York restaurant, and Don just says, I'm not interested in working for you. I just wanted to see what kind of a horse's ass wouldn't call me back. And Roone apologized. He was very bad at calling people back. And it's like in the movies. He writes down on a napkin a number, and he slides the napkin across the table, and Don opens it up, and it says $20,000 salary Monday Night Football for 1 year. So Don takes a napkin and writes on the back, and he slides it back. 3-year contract, $30,000 a year. Roone says, that's not in my budget. Don says, quote, this will be the greatest money you ever spent. He's probably right. He's probably right. One line, so he goes on TV, and this is the first time America really hears Don talk. And I had this line in my first draft of my book, but I took it out for some reason. I wish I hadn't. I wrote, that voice, manly, sexy, East Texas twang. When you heard Dandy Don talk, it sounded like he was talking through a smile. Sounded like he was talking through a smile, because he probably was. Mrs. Meredith said to me, she goes, Don didn't hate Howard Cosell. We brought him to our house. We entertained him. We got along. But what Don said was, Howard was annoying to me for the one reason. He used big words when he didn't have to. So one time, Don, there's a game going on, and well, if he were here right now, Howard Cosell would go, "There's Dave Lieber up on the stage, here in the most splendiferous fashion," and Don would say, "Just say he's here." Don went from nobody really knowing who he was to like the most popular guy in America in like 5 or 10 weeks, because that's how long it took for America to get irritated by Howard Cosell. And, one of the best things about Don was when the score was lopsided at the end of a game and one team was knocking another one out and there was nothing to watch, what did they do? He sang. What did he sing? The party's over. That's right. The party's over. Yeah. If I had left that out of this talk, the whole room would be angry at me. And Willie Nelson said to Don, Willie wrote the song, and Willie said, "Don, you should pay me money for so many times you've sung that." So when Don walked away from Monday Night Football, then he got hired at NBC, and he did broadcasting with Kurt Gowdy, who's a great guy but doesn't have that kind of sense of humor. And he started to become, and he became an actor. He started doing, on NBC, he did TV movies, and he played guest spots on TV shows, and he was on a lot of different things. He even was the host of The Tonight Show when Johnny Carson was on one of his many vacations. But I think one of the toughest things that Don had dealt with in his life, besides his marriages, well, the last one was good. We'll get to that. Was that he dealt with two of the most difficult men in the planet. I mean, I don't know anybody who would be more difficult to deal with than Coach Tom Landry and Howard Cosell. Landry wouldn't talk to him. I mean, Don said Landry didn't talk to me for 2 years. I want to tell you why I picked this cover here. And it shows Coach Landry chewing out Don. You can see from Don's body language, he's standing there with his hand on his hip. He's got a sarcastic kind of look on his face. And Landry is just chewing him out. And the reason I picked that was because the great conflicts that they had in life together was the fact that, Coach Landry was a Bible boy and Don was a wild man. But also, Don didn't like that Landry called the plays. He wanted to call his own plays as quarterback. And so what happened was, in one game, Landry called the play. The guy ran it in the huddle. Don goes, "I don't like that play." He goes, "Let's do this. Pete Gent, you go here. Bob Hayes, you go this way." And he started naming all the players and what they do. And they scored a touchdown. And he goes back to the dugout, to the sidelines, and he expects Landry to praise him. But Landry doesn't praise him. Landry chews him out and said, "You didn't run my play." It's sad, really. All Don wanted from Landry was, "Good job. Way to go, I'm proud of you." And Landry would never say that. When a defensive player would make an interception, Landry wouldn't congratulate him. He'd say, "That's his job. That's what he's supposed to do." And if you're a sensitive person like Don was, you want your boss to say you do good. I don't think you can tell the story of the 1960s Cowboys without talking about this Bubbles Cash. Who remembers Bubble Cash? Yeah, not too many. I know you probably can't see this on the back, but what it is, it's a woman in a leopard skin mini skirt and a halter top, I think, and go-go boots, and she has two pom-poms that she's holding up right here strategically. Two cotton candy pom-pom balls. She was a stripper. She danced at Jack Ruby's Carousel Club. And she would come in the first quarter down the center aisle, the 50-yard line, and the game would stop. I mean, one time, one of the first times she came, it was really amazing. I mean, this wouldn't happen in the NFL today. She comes down the stairs, and in this picture, there's 40 people I counted them, laughing and smiling. And that's like a lot of people, because they didn't have much to smile back then in the early days of the Cowboys. And so Don says, what's going on? What's going on? And Bob Hayes says, it's Bubbles Cash. Don looks over and he goes, time out. Landry is ticked off because they don't get that many timeouts, right? So she followed the team on the road, and her picture was in the program. And there, you can see it very good up on that screen. Good, yeah. And her nickname was, her real name was SMA Cash. So her real name was Cash. And she would spell it Bubbles Cash, capital B, dollar sign. So Tex Schramm, who's the general manager of the Cowboys from 1960 to 1989, he looks at this and he goes, we could make money with this. And the outgrowth of Bubbles is something called the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders. We got to give her credit for that. She ran for governor of Texas twice. Does anybody remember that? Her campaign slogan was, let's see, what was it? It was win with cash. Yeah. There's a reporter at the Morning News with me. Her name is Sarah Hapola, and she has studied the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders. And she said the day that Bubble Cash walked down the center aisle for the first time was the day the sexual revolution arrived in Dallas. I don't know if that's true, but I was certainly going to mention it. Oh, a couple of more quick Cowboy stories before we forget. One of the backup quarterbacks for him was a guy named Jerry Rome. And Jerry says to the sports writer, I can't remember which one, he goes, I shouldn't be telling you this, but I got to tell you what happened in the quarterback meeting with Landry. Landry's got his back to us, and he's doing X's and O's. And meanwhile, Don is playing with his cigar. He's twirling it around. He's doing magic tricks with it, and all the other guys are laughing. And Landry turns around and sees what's going on, and Don quickly sticks the cigar in his mouth. Only it was the wrong end. And he starts going, and cool Landry goes, is everything okay, Don? How many of you knew, and I didn't know this, how many of you knew that Don Meredith would sing in the huddles? Anybody up there in the balcony? He would sing, he'd get up there and he'd sing to his teammates in the huddles. You know, it was amazing. He thought it calmed them down, made them all ready to go out there and all. I don't know. You remember Walt Garrison? Yeah. So Walt wrote the best Cowboys book of all, I think, and he talked about how he and Don would do all these practical jokes with each other. One time, at the end of your rookie year in the NFL, Don would take you out and get drunk. He called up Garrison. He said, okay, we're going out tonight. And Garrison said, no, I'm going to watch TV. No, he says, you're going out tonight. Come to the lobby. And there in the lobby is Don wearing a chauffeur's hat and a limousine. He's got a limousine. And he says, get in the car. What are you drinking? And Garrison says, I'm drinking Coke. And Don says, what are you drinking? He says, oh, I guess I'll have bourbon. And Don said, I'm paying. So they go to this restaurant, and Don's knocking him back, and he's not feeling a thing. But Walt is practically under the table. He's never drank this much in his life. And he at one point, he takes his drink, and he pours it in the potted plant next to the table. And Don says, don't you ever do that again. Well, the next day, Don is like chipper and fine and has no hangover, but Walt can't even walk. And what does Don do? He says, Coach, I need you to call Garrison in all the running plays. So every time, he'd come back to the huddle, he'd score 2 yards and 4 yards and 6 yards, and Don would make fun of him. And they became the best of friends. He said, no one is allowed to pick on Walt Garrison except for me. Walt died about 6 months ago, which is, we're losing these guys. When Don retired at 32 and became that stockbroker, his whole body was racked with injuries. He broke his nose 14 times. He would leave the hospital to come to a game. I mean, that's how bad it was. And it had to do with the fact that his body was sort of weak from polio, but, he couldn't take it anymore. Okay, so let's jump back to Monday Night Football. And what happened back then in 1970 when no one believed Monday Night Football would be a success, but of course it was right out of the gate because of these two guys, Don and Howard. And they turned out to be the greatest comedy team in America since Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis. And the reason why the show jumped up to #1 was because women watched football for the first time. They didn't care about the game. They cared about the banter between the guys. They thought it was really funny. But it wasn't funny for Howard Cosell because, he would tell it like it is and he would say bad things about the halfback of the other team and they'd want to kill him. Don said, I can't walk anywhere with Howard because if the bullet misses him, it's going to hit me. Do you remember what went on back then? They would have contests at bars where they would say, okay, the winner gets to shoot the TV when Howard Cosell comes on. Do you remember this? They would do this. But here you had this Brooklyn Jew with a toupee versus this, Methodist, handsome Southern man. And the conflict between two of them was just absolutely fantastic. But you remember what I said about him using big words? So at one game, this guy climbs up the wire in the stadium and disrupts the whole game. And Howard is angry, and he tells the TV audience, he says, Giffer, that's Frank Gifford. He said, Giffer, it's beyond my perspicacity why spectators of this once splendiferous sport behave the way they do. How can the NFL allow this inexorable rowdiness to continue? And Don said, just shut up. This right here is really the greatest broadcasting team of all time. It didn't matter who was playing in the game. They were the story. They'd come into town, and they'd get the key to the city. And they had parades and banquets. It didn't matter who was playing football. It was the Monday Night Football crew were there. He and Howard did 185 shows together on Monday night. That's a lot, 185 shows. And there's 3 incidents from their career that seem to be remembered the most. In one of the early games, there was a wide receiver on one of the teams, and his name was Fair, F-A-I-R, Hooker. And they said something about, there goes Fair Hooker, and Don goes on live TV. He says, I never met one of those. The reason why I think that's important is because in 1970, 1971, you didn't have TV hosts talking about prostitution, even if it was just a joke, Another time, in 1972, Don made the mistake of referring to President Nixon as Tricky Dick live on TV. ABC is terrified that they're going to lose their license, because Nixon was saying, I'm going to take licenses away. So ABC says, you got to go on TV Monday night and you got to apologize. So Don gets up and he goes, hey, Gifford, help me out. You got yourself into this, you get yourself out. And then there's my favorite story of when they were together. The game was over. He hadn't sung Turn Out the Lights yet, but the one team was winning by 30 points, and there was a quarter left. And Chet Fort in the sound truck for Monday Night Football, he says, cameraman, go find me somebody in the stands. So they're looking around. They finally find this guy. And the camera points straight at him. And the guy does something, I don't know, I'm going to do it. I shouldn't do it, but I'm going to do it. He looks at the camera and he goes like this. And Don goes, he's just telling everybody they're number one. Sometimes people ask me, they say, was there alcohol in the broadcast booth? Well, Frank didn't drink. He was straight arrow. And Don had a little bit just to loosen up. But Cosell would bring a whole gallon jug and put it under the seat, thinking no one's going to see it. Of all the places I read this in, it was a profile in TV Guide. Remember TV Guide? Well, he didn't hide it in front of the TV Guide reporter. And so in one game, Howard drank so much, he threw up on live TV. And guess where the vomit landed? On Don Meredith's brand new cowboy boots. And Don says to the audience, Howard won't be with us for the rest of the game. Something's come up. So Howard gets back to New York in the middle of the night, and the whole newspaper world the next day was Howard Cosell drunk? And they said, ABC said he had vertigo. So we talked a little bit before about how Don went into acting. And so I called up one of the actors that he acted with in Police Story, a man named Tony LoBianco. Do you remember him? He had bushy black eyebrows. He was a Sicilian American, and he was in the French Connection, and he had this show on NBC called Police Story. And they said, hey, we're going to put Don Meredith on the show with you, Tony, and Tony, you be the bad cop, and Don can be the good cop. And you can see episodes of this on YouTube. And Tony died 3 weeks ago, I think, 4 weeks ago. So my interview with him was the last one that he did. But he told me a couple of stories that I really like. And one of them was one day Don walked into the production room and he said, I'm really upset. They go, why, Don? He goes, because I never get to be the bad guy. Tony's always the bad guy. I want to be the bad guy. So Tony says, all right, let him be the bad guy. Let's change the script. So they did, and they started filming, and Don was the bad guy. He pushes the criminal against the wall. He chokeholds him. He yells at him. He browbeats him. He gets a confession, and the director says, cut. This ain't working. Don Meredith, you cannot play the bad guy because you're too much of a good guy. He couldn't even act like a bad guy. So Don was married 4 times, which is something that Amon Carter had in common too. The difference is Don married his college sweetheart, and then they got divorced, and then he remarried her again. So that knocks 2 off right there with the same woman. He had a second wife named Cheryl, and then his third wife was Susan, who he was married to for almost 40 years, and was totally devoted to him and his life and helping him become the man that he wanted to be. His brother, Billy, they had 3 children among the marriages too. His brother, Billy Jack, started a company in Irving called DocuTel, which invented the ATM machine. And so to help his brother sell the machines, Don would show up with cowboy cheerleaders, which made it really hard for these businessmen not to sign on the dotted line. Near the end of his life, he was hooked up to an oxygen tank. He had emphysema, and when visitors would come by, there weren't many because the mailbox had a fake name on it, but when visitors would come by, he would say, hey, welcome. Have you noticed I dyed my hair gray? And he would say, I'm going to sing for you. And he recorded a couple of songs in the 60s on a 45 RPM, which I have. They're good songs. And he would play the song on the computer, and then he would sing along with it. And so that was his idea of a good time. Of course, now in Mount Vernon, they have a museum, a Don Meredith Museum, which is stupendous. And they also have Don Meredith Stadium. When the Don Meredith Museum opened up, they told me there were lines around the block to get autographs. We hardly have scratched the surface with these stories. There's so much more. I believe he's the genesis, the creation of what became America's team. And in my book, I say there's a surprise about Don on every single page. It's really uncanny. There was so much to write about. And I also like the way he used humor for leadership. He was the team leader, but he used humor to get what he wanted. This book, when I was going through this book, an obituary fell out, and it was obituary for Clinton Murchison from 1987, when he died. His father was a great oil man, one of the best, and Clinton, if it wasn't for Clinton, there'd be no Dallas Cowboys today. But in the obituary, it says that the secret to his success as an owner was to leave the managing of his employees to others, and he never got in the way of the general manager. Huh? Do you see where I'm going with this? So when I wrote this book, I made a promise to myself that the name of J.J. will never appear in this book, ever. Yeah. So every time I have to mention his name, I call him a man from Arkansas who bought the team. That's how I refer to him as. And what happens now is that this book cannot be sold at the Dallas Cowboys shop because I have, made fun of the king. But I tell you what, I sacrifice sales for principles, So let's end the formal part of this, and we can have some questions and comments, but let's just end it with this. Turn out the lights. The party's over. They say all good things must end. Call it a night, the party's over, and tomorrow starts the same old thing again. Thank you.
Questions, anybody?
You got a question,
Rod?
Trivial compared to what you've told us, but Don Meredith, there used to be a high school basketball tournament in Dallas called the Dr. Pepper Tournament.
That's right.
You know where I'm going with this.
It's in the book.
He was the leading scorer
That's right.
for the Dr. Pepper Tournament for, probably doesn't hold the record now, but he held it for many, many years. Tremendous basketball player.
No, you're right. In fact, most people don't realize this, but he got a basketball scholarship to SMU, not a football. And at the Dr. Pepper Invitational Tournament, where he was real tall and a great ball player with his socks stuffed with padding, he scored the most anyone ever scored in a game, and then he scored the most anybody ever scored in the series. And they upset Crozier Tech, which was this team that was supposed to win, and they gave Don MVP, and he got a Dr. Pepper ice chest. Yeah.
I got one.
Yeah.
You said that Vince Lombardi had done something sort of dishonest in the Ice Bowl. I think I know what it was, but tell us what.
Well, he built this underground electric grid that was supposed to heat the field. And GE, General Electric, promised that the field would never freeze. But when it was minus 46 degrees wind chill factor, it didn't work. And it turned out somebody had turned it off. And the players, I quote a bunch of players from their autobiographies, they say, yeah, we believe he cheated. But when I told one person about it, they said, you can't say that because Vince is the great god of NFL. But I don't know. Yes?
I don't know in the book, did you interview Leroy Jordan at all?
I didn't.
Leroy on the road, Coach Landry put Leroy on the road with Don. They roomed together. You had Don, the kind of, not the choir boy, and Leroy was kind of the choir boy. I was just curious if you ever heard anything about them on the road together.
No, I don't think I did, no. No.
Anybody else?
Do you remember Sam Huff? He was a Washington defensive player. He used to knock the crap out of Don. And high jump Don, just crushed Don. Well, in one game, Don was wearing a vest to protect his fractured ribs, and in the vest was red dye. And Huff grabs him and knocks him down, and the dye explodes in his shirt, and now Don's just lying there. And Huff goes, "Are you all right? Are you all right? Tell my mother I love her." And Huff was so mad. Another quick story. I love this. I want to tell it real quick. You know how Peyton Manning would go, "Omaha," right? And then Dak Prescott goes, "Here we go." Well, Don was getting his butt kicked. And he said, "I'm calling the play on peaches." So he gets up there, he goes, "Banana, apples, watermelons, peaches." Boom. And the other team is so hysterical that they think it's so funny, they laid him off. They stopped beating him up. You know? They knew this guy wasn't like any other quarterback ever in history. Any more comments or questions? Oh, yeah, we've got a couple here.
You may have put this in your book, but one of Don's favorite sayings, "If ands and buts were candy and nuts, we'd all have a Merry Christmas."
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, that's in the book. Because a politician, when I would interview this politician in Pennsylvania, he'd go, if the buts were candy and nuts, we'd all have a Merry Christmas. And I didn't know what he was talking about. But Don Meredith brought that phrase out into the public, you know. Yeah, that's right. I love that. Yeah.
One more.
You tell us a little bit about Don's last years. I understand he became pretty much a recluse.
Yeah.
Just say something about Don's last 20 years or so.
Yeah, one of the chapters is called "Was Don a Recluse?" And he did hide out from the public because he had done everything a man could do, really, you know. So there was a thought I had on that. I can't remember what it was. No, dementia. No, he didn't have dementia. I know what I was going to tell you. We have this reporter at the paper. He's one of my favorite reporters. His name is Brad Townsend. And he worked for years to get to interview Don Meredith. He called it the holy grail of sports writing. And he went in there and he spent the day with Susan and Don. And he said, "Don, you realize today is the 50th anniversary of when you signed your contract with Clint Murkison?" He goes, 50 years. Wow, 50 years. Thank you for coming to my house and bringing that up. Thank you. But he was serious, so he was like touched by it. And then it ends by the chapter about Brad says, people asked Brad, "How's Don doing?" And Don said, "He's happy and content." He was a happy man, and I attribute that to his bride, Susan. She took good care of him. Yeah, but I don't think he had dementia. There was one more quick thing. One day the phone rang, and Susan picked it up, and the voice said, "Is Don there?" And she said, "Who's this?" And he goes, "It's Willie." And she goes, "Willie who?" And she goes, "Willie Nelson." So she gives Don the phone, and she's in the other room, and she can hear Don and Willie doing duets on the phone together. You know, I want to thank all of you for coming. I've got some books out there. I take credit card, yay. I'll sign them for you. And I want to thank the family for continuing 68 years, David. And this has been fun. Thank you.
Dave, thank you. I don't think anybody tells better stories about the true characters from this area than Dave Lieber. DonMeredithBook.com.
Yeah, for those of you who are watching this on video, DonMeredithBook.com. We're trying to stay away from Amazon.
Next week we have the former CIA agent David McCluskey with his novel Moscow X. So we'll see you next Wednesday.